Sometimes the people who carry the deepest wounds are the ones the world refuses to see, and sometimes those same people rise so high that the ones who laughed at them can barely lift their heads to look up. This is not a fairy tale. This is not one of those stories where everything works out because someone got lucky. This is a story about a woman who was burned, broken, and buried under the cruelty of people who should have loved her. And yet, she clawed her way out of every grave they dug for her. If you think strength means never falling down, you have never met someone like her. Her name was Amara. And the day the room full of officers went silent was not the beginning of her story. It was the reward for every tear she never let them see. Amara was born in a small town that sat on the edge of a long, dusty highway in the southern part of the country. The town did not have much to offer. There was one school, one clinic that was open only 3 days a week, and a market that came alive on Saturday mornings when the farmers brought their crops to sell. The houses were small and made of concrete blocks with tin roofs that rattled during the rainy season. Most families in that town lived the same kind of life. They worked hard, they prayed hard, and they hoped their children would one day leave and find something better. Amara's family was not like the others. Her father was a man named Joseph, and Joseph was the kind of man that the town whispered about but never confronted. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a voice that could shake the walls of their tiny house. On the outside, he smiled at neighbors and shook hands at the church door every Sunday. But behind the walls of that house, Joseph was a different man. He drank heavily, and when he drank, his hands became weapons. Amara's mother, Grace, was a quiet woman with tired eyes. She had been beautiful once, but years of fear and bruises had turned her into a shadow. Grace never fought back. She never left. She told herself that staying was the right thing to do for her children. Amara was the second of 4 children. She had an older brother named Daniel, a younger sister named Esther, and the youngest was a boy named Samuel. Among all of them, Amara was the one who seemed to attract her father's anger the most. It was not because she was bad or disobedient. It was because she was brave. Even as a small child, Amara had a way of looking at her father that made him uncomfortable. She did not cower the way her mother did. She did not run and hide like Daniel. When Joseph raised his voice, Amara stood still and looked straight at him with those dark, steady eyes. And that made him furious. A man like Joseph did not want courage in his house. He wanted fear. He wanted control. And this little girl, barely 7 years old, refused to give him either. The beatings started early. Joseph would hit Amara for small things: a plate not washed properly, a door left open, a look on her face that he decided was disrespectful. Grace would cry and beg him to stop, but her begging only seemed to make him angrier. He would shove Grace aside and turn back to Amara with even more rage. The neighbors heard the screams sometimes, but nobody came. In that town, what happened inside a man's house was considered his business. Nobody wanted to get involved. Nobody wanted to be the one to challenge Joseph. By the time Amara was 10 years old, she had learned to move through the world like a ghost. She kept her head down at home, spoke only when spoken to, and did her chores with mechanical precision. But at school, she was different. At school, Amara came alive. She loved reading more than anything. The school library was small, just 2 shelves of old books donated by a church group from the city. But to Amara, it was a palace. She would sit in the corner during break time, her legs pulled up to her chest, a book open on her knees, and she would disappear into stories about brave women and distant lands and people who overcame impossible things. Her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Okoro, noticed Amara early on. She saw something in the girl that the rest of the world seemed determined to ignore: intelligence, fire, a hunger to become something more. Mrs. Okoro would sometimes keep Amara after class, not for punishment, but for extra lessons. She taught Amara things that were not in the school curriculum. She taught her about history, about women who had changed the world, about the power of education. She told Amara that her mind was her greatest weapon and that no one could take it away from her. Amara listened to every word like it was water and she was dying of thirst. Those afternoons with Mrs. Okoro became the only safe place in Amara's life, the only time she felt like she mattered. But home was always waiting for her. And the older Amara got, the worse things became. When she was 12, something happened that would change the course of her life forever. It was a Thursday evening in the dry season. The air was hot and thick, and the sun had gone down, but the heat had not. Joseph had been drinking since the afternoon. He had lost money in a card game and had come home already furious. Grace was cooking in the small kitchen at the back of the house when Joseph walked in and began shouting about the food taking too long. Grace tried to calm him down, but he grabbed her by the arm and threw her against the wall. Amara heard the crash from the room she shared with Esther and Samuel. She came running out. What she saw made her blood go cold. Her mother was on the floor, holding her arm, crying. Joseph was standing over her with a bottle in his hand. Something inside Amara snapped. She ran forward and stood between her mother and her father. She screamed at him to stop. She told him to leave her mother alone. Joseph looked down at his 12-year-old daughter and his face twisted with a kind of rage that Amara had never seen before. He did not hit her with his hand this time. He grabbed the pot of boiling water from the stove and threw it at her. The pain was something that cannot be described in words. It was like the entire world turned white and then red and then black. Amara screamed a scream that the neighbors said they heard 3 houses away. The boiling water hit the left side of her face, her neck, and her left shoulder. Her skin blistered and peeled almost instantly. Grace screamed and grabbed Amara and ran out of the house with her. She ran to the clinic, but the clinic was closed. It was Thursday, not one of the 3 days it was open. Grace ran to the nearest neighbor who had a car, a man named Mr. Adebayo, and begged him to drive them to the hospital in the next town. Mr. Adebayo took one look at Amara and ran to get his keys without saying a word. The drive to the hospital took 45 minutes, but it felt like 45 hours. Amara was lying in the back seat with her head on her mother's lap. She was shaking and crying, and the pain was so intense that she kept drifting in and out of consciousness. Grace was praying out loud, her voice cracking, her tears falling on Amara's forehead. Mr. Adebayo drove as fast as his old car would allow, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. At the hospital, the doctors worked on Amara for hours. The burns were severe. 2nd and 3rd degree burns covered a large portion of the left side of her face and her neck and shoulder. The doctors told Grace that Amara would survive, but that the scarring would be permanent. There was no plastic surgery available in that hospital. There was no specialized burn unit. They did what they could with what they had, and they told Grace to bring Amara back for regular dressing changes. When the police came to the hospital to ask what happened, Grace told them that Amara had had an accident in the kitchen, that the pot had fallen. The officer wrote it down and did not ask any more questions. Joseph was never arrested. He was never questioned. He sat at home and drank more, and told Daniel that Amara had gotten what she deserved for talking back. Amara spent 3 weeks in the hospital. During those 3 weeks, she did not speak much. She lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand why her own father had done this to her. She was 12 years old. She had only tried to protect her mother, and this was the price she had paid. The nurses were kind to her. One of them, a young woman named Nurse Rita, would sit with Amara in the evenings and read to her from a newspaper because there were no books. Nurse Rita told Amara that she was brave and that the scars did not define her. Amara heard the words but did not believe them. How could scars not define her when they were the first thing anyone would ever see? When Amara finally went home, everything was different. Joseph ignored her completely, as if she did not exist. In some ways, that was better than the beatings. But the silence carried its own kind of cruelty. He looked through her like she was a window. Grace tried to make up for it by being extra gentle with Amara, but Grace's gentleness was always mixed with guilt, and Amara could feel it. She did not blame her mother. She understood that Grace was trapped too, but understanding did not take away the loneliness. Going back to school was the hardest part. When Amara walked into the classroom for the first time after the incident, the room went quiet. Every pair of eyes locked onto the left side of her face. The bandages were gone by then, but the scars were fresh and angry and impossible to ignore. Red, twisted skin that pulled at the corner of her left eye and stretched down her neck like a map of pain. Some children stared in horror. Some whispered to each other behind their hands. And one boy, a boy named Chitty, who had always been the class bully, said out loud what everyone else was thinking. He called her a monster. He said she looked like something from a nightmare. Half the class laughed. Amara did not cry, not in front of them. She walked to her seat, sat down, opened her notebook, and began to write the date. Her hand was shaking, but her face showed nothing. She had learned from years of living with Joseph how to swallow pain and keep moving. But inside, something was breaking. The laughter of children is a different kind of cruelty than the violence of a father. It comes from the people who are supposed to be your equals, your peers, the ones who should understand. And it cuts in places that fists cannot reach. Mrs. Okoro found Amara during break time sitting alone behind the school building. Amara was not crying. She was just sitting there, staring at the ground, her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Okoro sat down next to her and did not say anything for a long time. Then she put her arm around Amara's shoulders and said something that Amara would carry with her for the rest of her life. She said that the world is full of small people who will try to make others feel small so they can feel big. She said that Amara's scars were proof that she had survived something that would have destroyed most people. And she said that one day, Amara would stand in rooms where those same people who laughed would not even be allowed to enter. Amara looked at Mrs. Okoro, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than pain. She felt a tiny spark of something. It was not hope exactly. It was more like defiance. A quiet, burning refusal to let the world decide her worth based on what her father had done to her face. From that day on, Amara threw herself into her studies with a ferocity that stunned everyone. She was always the first student in the classroom and the last to leave. She borrowed every book she could find. She wrote essays that were so good that Mrs. Okoro started entering them in regional competitions. She studied by candlelight at home because the electricity in their house was unreliable. She studied during lunch breaks. She studied while other children played. She was not doing this because she loved studying, although she did. She was doing this because she had decided that education was her only way out. It was the only door that her father could not lock, the only road that the bullies could not block, the only thing in her life that belonged entirely to her. The mockery did not stop. If anything, it got worse as Amara got older. Teenagers can be far crueler than children. The girls in her class would whisper about her behind her back, saying that no man would ever want to marry a woman with a face like that. The boys would dare each other to go talk to her as a joke. Shidi, the same boy who had called her a monster, started a nickname for her that the whole school picked up. He called her Half-Face. It spread through the school like a disease. Even younger students who did not know Amara would point at her in the hallway and call her Half-Face. Every time she heard it, it was like a small knife being pushed between her ribs, but she never reacted. She never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her break. At home, things had settled into a grim routine. Joseph continued to drink and to beat Grace, but he left Amara alone. It was as if the incident with the boiling water had crossed a line even for him, and he dealt with his guilt not by apologizing or changing, but by pretending Amara did not exist. Daniel, Amara's older brother, had dropped out of school and started working at the market. Esther was quiet and obedient and did everything she could to stay invisible. Little Samuel was the only one who treated Amara the way he always had. He was too young to understand what the scars meant to the world. To him, Amara was just his big sister, and he loved her completely and without condition. Amara held on to Samuel's love like a lifeline. Every evening, she would help him with his homework and tell him stories before bed. She told him stories about brave soldiers and clever generals and people who fought against impossible odds and won. She did not know it then, but those stories were not just for Samuel. They were for herself. Every hero she described, every battle she narrated, was a version of the future she was building in her mind. A future where she was not Half-Face. A future where she was not the girl with the scars. A future where she was something that none of them could ever imagine. When Amara was 16, she took the national examination. The results came back 6 weeks later, and when Mrs. Okoro read them out in front of the school, the room went quiet for the second time in Amara's life. But this time, it was not because of her scars. It was because Amara had scored the highest marks in the entire district, not just in her school, in every school in the district. The girl they called Half-Face had outperformed every single student, including the ones with private tutors and expensive textbooks, and parents who had the money to send them to extra lessons. The silence in that room was different from the silence on the day she had returned with her scars. This silence had something else in it. It had shock. It had disbelief. And underneath all of that, it had the beginning of something that looked very much like respect. Okoro smiled. Amara did not. She simply nodded, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. She had a long way to go, and she knew it. This was just the first step. The road ahead was longer and harder than anything she had faced so far. But for the first time in her life, Amara felt like she was walking toward something instead of running away from something. And that made all the difference. That evening, she sat outside the house on the concrete step and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and scattered across the darkness like spilled sugar. Samuel came and sat next to her and asked her what she was thinking about. Amara looked at her little brother and smiled. She told him she was thinking about the future. He asked her what the future looked like. She did not answer for a long time. Then she said that the future looked like a room full of people who had never dared to call her half-face. Samuel did not understand what she meant. But years later, when he was standing in that very room, watching his sister walk in wearing a uniform that most people only dreamed of, he would remember that night, and he would finally understand. The scholarship letter arrived 3 months after the examination results. It was from a government program that identified high-performing students from rural areas and offered them full scholarships to attend boarding schools in the city. Amara had been selected. When Grace read the letter, she cried, not from sadness, but from a relief so deep that it seemed to drain every ounce of strength from her body. She held Amara and told her that this was her chance, that she must take it and never look back. Joseph said nothing. He sat in his chair and stared at the wall and drank his drink and said absolutely nothing. Amara packed her things into a single bag. She did not have much. A few clothes, her school notebooks, a Bible that Grace had given her, and one photograph of herself with Samuel taken at the market when he was 3. She said goodbye to Esther and Daniel. She held Samuel for a long time and told him to be good, and to study hard and to remember the stories she had told him. Then she hugged her mother and whispered in her ear that she would come back for her, that one day she would come back and take her away from this house and from this man and from this life. Grace nodded but did not believe it. She had stopped believing in rescue a long time ago. Mr. Adebayo drove Amara to the bus station. It was the same man who had driven her to the hospital 4 years earlier. As she climbed out of the car, he looked at her and told her to make them proud. Amara nodded. She picked up her bag, walked to the bus, and did not look back. The town grew smaller and smaller in the window until it disappeared completely. And with it disappeared the girl they had called Half-Face. The person who stepped off that bus in the city 6 hours later was someone new, someone who had been forged in fire, literally, and who was ready to walk into a world that did not yet know her name. The city was everything and nothing like Amara had imagined. She had seen pictures in books and on the old television that Mr. Adebayo sometimes let the neighborhood children watch on weekends. But pictures could not prepare her for the noise, the speed, and the sheer, overwhelming size of it all. The buildings were taller than anything she had ever seen. The roads were wider than the entire main street of her town. Cars honked and people shouted, and vendors called out prices, and music blared from shops, and everything moved at a pace that made Amara feel like she was standing still while the entire world spun around her. The boarding school was called Federal Government College, and it sat on a large compound surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. There were dormitories for girls and boys on opposite sides of the campus, a massive assembly hall, science laboratories, a computer room that Amara had never seen anything like before, and a library that was bigger than her entire house back home. When she walked into that library for the first time and saw the rows and rows of books stretching from floor to ceiling, she felt something inside her chest expand. It was like her lungs had been breathing in shallow sips her whole life. And now, for the first time, they were taking in a full, deep breath. But the city school brought new challenges that Amara had not expected. The students here were different from the ones back home. Many of them came from wealthy families. They wore expensive watches and carried phones and talked about vacations to places that Amara had only read about. They spoke English with polished accents and used words that Amara sometimes had to look up later in the dictionary. And when they saw Amara, when they saw the scars that crawled across the left side of her face and down her neck, their reactions were not much different from the children back home. The cruelty just wore better clothes. On her first day in the dormitory, Amara was assigned a bunk in a room with 11 other girls. She placed her single bag on the lower bunk and began to unpack her few belongings when one of the girls, a tall girl with braided hair and gold earrings named Folake, walked over and looked at her with open curiosity. Folake did not try to hide her staring. She tilted her head to one side like she was examining something in a museum, and then turned to the other girls and said something in a low voice that made them all burst into laughter. Amara did not hear what she said, but she did not need to. She had been the subject of that kind of laughter for years. She knew exactly what it sounded like. The first few months at Federal Government College were among the loneliest of Amara's life. The girls in her dormitory were not violent like her father, or openly cruel like Chitty back home. They were something worse in many ways. They were dismissive. They treated Amara as if she were beneath their notice. They formed groups and went to the dining hall together and studied together and whispered secrets to each other, and Amara was never invited. When she walked past them in the hallway, they would sometimes go quiet, and she knew they had been talking about her. Other times, they did not even bother to lower their voices. She heard fragments that cut like glass. That poor village girl. Have you seen her face? She must have done something terrible in a past life. How does she even look at herself in the mirror? Amara dealt with the isolation the only way she knew how. She studied. She studied with a discipline and intensity that bordered on obsession. While the other girls stayed up late talking and laughing in the dormitory, Amara sat in the reading room with her textbooks spread out before her. She read every chapter twice. She solved every problem in the math workbook, even the ones that were not assigned. She memorized dates and formulas and vocabulary words and scientific processes until they were embedded so deep in her mind that nothing could shake them loose. The teachers began to notice her almost immediately. Her essays were precise and thoughtful. Her answers in class were confident and correct. She asked questions that showed she had not just read the material, but had thought deeply about it. One teacher in particular took an interest in Amara. His name was Colonel Barco, and he was a retired military officer who now taught history and civic education at the school. Colonel Barco was a lean, sharp man in his 60s with a shaved head and a voice that commanded attention without ever needing to be raised. He had served in the military for 30 years and had fought in 2 conflicts before retiring and dedicating his life to teaching. He ran his classroom like a military briefing. Everything was structured. Everything was disciplined. And he had no patience for laziness, excuses, or disrespect. Colonel Barco noticed Amara because of an essay she wrote about leadership during wartime. The assignment was simple. Write about a leader who inspired you and explain why. Most students wrote about presidents or famous activists or religious figures. Amara wrote about a woman named Familio Ransom Kuti, a Nigerian activist who had led protests against colonial taxation and had fought for women's rights at a time when such things were considered radical and dangerous. Amara's essay was not just a biography. It was an analysis. She wrote about how true leadership was not about power or position, but about the willingness to stand in the gap when everyone else had stepped back. She wrote about how the bravest people are not the ones who have nothing to lose, but the ones who have everything to lose and still choose to fight. Colonel Barco read the essay 3 times. Then he asked Amara to stay after class. When the other students had left, he sat on the edge of his desk and looked at her for a long moment. He did not look at her scars. He looked at her eyes. Then he told her that her essay was the best piece of student writing he had read in 20 years of teaching. He asked her what she wanted to do with her life. Amara was quiet for a moment. Nobody had ever asked her that question before. Mrs. Okoro had told her she could be something great. But she had never asked what Amara herself wanted. The question felt strange and new, like wearing shoes for the first time. Amara told Colonel Barco that she wanted to join the military. The words came out before she had time to think about them, and once they were out, she realized that they were true. She had always been drawn to the stories of soldiers and warriors and people who dedicated their lives to something bigger than themselves. She admired the structure, the discipline, the idea that a person could be judged not by their appearance but by their actions, their courage, and their commitment. In the military, she believed, no one would care about the scars on her face. They would only care about what she could do. Colonel Barco did not laugh. He did not tell her it was impossible. He did not give her a speech about how the military was difficult for women. Instead, he nodded slowly and said that if she was serious, he would help her prepare. He told her that the military entrance examination was one of the most competitive in the country. Thousands applied every year, and only a few hundred were selected. The physical requirements were demanding. The written examination was brutal, and the interview process was designed to break people who were not ready. He asked her if she was willing to do what it took. Amara looked at him and said yes without hesitation. She had been doing what it took her entire life. She did not know any other way to live. From that day on, Colonel Barkor became Amara's mentor in the truest sense of the word. He gave her extra reading materials about military history and strategy. He taught her about the structure of the armed forces, the different branches, the ranks, the traditions. He woke her up at 5 in the morning, 3 days a week, to run laps around the school compound. He pushed her body and her mind to limits she did not know she had, and through it all, he never once treated her differently because of her scars. To Colonel Barkor, Amara was a soldier in training, and soldiers were not defined by their wounds. They were defined by their willingness to keep fighting despite them. The social situation at school did not improve much during those years, but Amara stopped caring about it. She had a purpose now. She had a direction. The whispers and the stares and the exclusion from social groups still stung sometimes, but they were background noise compared to the roar of ambition that was building inside her. She had one friend, a quiet girl named Blessing, who slept in the bunk above hers. Blessing was not from a wealthy family either. She was a scholarship student from a fishing village on the coast, and she understood what it felt like to be an outsider in a place where money and connections determined your worth. Blessing and Amara did not talk much, but they shared a silent understanding that was stronger than most friendships built on constant conversation. In her final year of school, Amara took the university entrance examination and the military entrance examination within the same month. She studied for both simultaneously, sleeping only 4 or 5 hours a night, eating her meals quickly so she could get back to her books, running every morning even when her body screamed for rest. Colonel Bako monitored her progress and adjusted her preparation based on her weaknesses. He was hard on her, harder than he was on any other student, because he knew that the world would be harder on her than it was on anyone else. He wanted her to be ready. The results came in stages. First, the university results. Amara had scored in the top 1% nationally. She had earned admission to study law at the most prestigious university in the country. It was the kind of achievement that would have been front-page news if it had belonged to a different kind of student, one with a famous last name or a powerful family. For Amara, it was a backup plan. She was proud of it, but it was not what she wanted most. The military results took longer. Amara waited for 6 weeks. Every day felt like a year. She checked the notice board at school obsessively. She listened to the radio for announcements. She lay awake at night, staring at the bottom of Blessing's bunk, running scenarios in her mind. What if she had not done well enough on the physical test? What if the interview panel had looked at her scars and decided she was not suitable? What if the entire dream she had built her life around was about to collapse? The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Colonel Barkor was the one who brought it to her. He found her in the reading room, bent over a textbook as usual, and he placed the envelope on the table in front of her without saying a word. The envelope was brown and official-looking with a government stamp in the corner. Amara's hands were shaking as she opened it. She read the first line, and then the second, and then the third. And then she read the whole thing again from the beginning because she was certain she had made a mistake. She had not made a mistake. The letter informed her that she had been selected for admission to the Nigerian Defense Academy. She was one of only 23 women accepted that year out of over 4,000 female applicants. The girl they called Half-Face. The girl whose own father had tried to destroy her. She was going to be a soldier. Colonel Bako watched her read the letter, and when she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, he did something she had never seen him do before. He smiled. Not a small, polite smile. A full, wide, genuine smile that made his sharp face look almost gentle. He told her that he had never been more proud of a student in his life. Then he straightened up, pulled his shoulders back, and saluted her. A retired colonel saluting a teenage girl in a school reading room. It was the first salute of her life. It would not be the last. Amara called her mother that evening from the school's payphone. When Grace heard the news, she broke down crying so hard that she could not speak for several minutes. Amara held the phone and listened to her mother cry, and she cried too, silently, the tears running over her scars and dripping off her chin. Grace told her that she was the bravest person she had ever known, that she had always known Amara was meant for something extraordinary, that her father could never take this away from her. Amara asked about Samuel. Grace Samuel was doing well in school, and that he talked about Amara every day. He told his classmates that his sister was going to be a general someday. Amara laughed through her tears and told her mother to tell Samuel that she was working on it. The Nigerian Defense Academy was located in Kaduna, a city in the northern part of the country. It was a place of discipline, tradition, and relentless physical and mental training. The cadets who entered its gates were expected to be the future leaders of the nation's military, and the academy made sure that only the strongest, smartest, and most resilient survived. The dropout rate in the first year alone was staggering. Cadets who had been stars in their schools and communities crumbled under the pressure. They could not handle the 5 a.m. wake-up calls, the endless drills, the punishing physical training, the academic workload that would have been demanding even without all the military requirements layered on top of it. Amara thrived. She thrived because everything the academy threw at her was easier than what she had already survived. The 5 a.m. wake-up calls were nothing to a girl who had been running laps around her school since she was 16. The physical training was nothing to someone whose body had been conditioned by Colonel Bacco's merciless regimen. The academic demands were nothing to a mind that had been sharpened by years of obsessive study, driven by the knowledge that education was her only escape. And the psychological pressure, the shouting drill sergeants, the deliberate attempts to break cadets down and build them back up, was nothing to a woman who had been broken by her own father at the age of 12 and had put herself back together piece by piece without anyone's help. But the academy brought one challenge that Amara had not fully prepared for. It was not the training or the academics or the discipline. In a military environment, every aspect of a cadet's appearance was examined and evaluated. Uniforms had to be perfect. Hair had to be regulation. Posture had to be flawless. And for the first time in a long time, Amara's scars were not just something that made her different. They were something that made her a target for a new kind of cruelty. Some of her fellow cadets, particularly a group of male cadets who resented the presence of women in the academy, used her scars as ammunition. They whispered that she did not belong there, that the academy was not a place for damaged goods, that she had been accepted as a charity case, a token of pity rather than merit. The ringleader of this group was a cadet named Lieutenant Candidate Obiora. He was the son of a retired brigadier general, and he carried his father's name like a shield that made him untouchable. Obiora was tall and physically imposing, and he had the kind of confidence that comes not from achievement but from privilege. He had grown up in military housing, attended the best schools, and had been groomed for the academy since birth. To him, Amara was an insult to everything the military represented. He could not understand how a scarred village girl could be walking the same grounds as the son of a general. Obiorah's harassment was subtle at first, a comment made just loud enough for Amara to hear during formation, a snicker when she passed him in the hallway, a whisper to his friends that always ended with them glancing in her direction and laughing. But over time, it escalated. He began undermining her in group exercises, giving her the most difficult or humiliating tasks during drills he was assigned to lead. He spread rumors that she had lied about her background to get sympathy from the selection board. He told anyone who would listen that she would not last a year. Amara endured it the way she had endured everything else in her life. She let the cruelty flow around her like water around a stone, and she focused on what she could control: her performance, her grades, her physical fitness scores, her marksmanship, her leadership assessments. In every measurable category, Amara was not just good. She was exceptional. She graduated first in her class in tactical studies. She set a record in the obstacle course that stood for 3 years after she completed it. She won the award for best academic performance in her cohort. And she did all of this while carrying the weight of scars that never let the world forget where she came from. During her time at the academy, Amara wrote letters to Samuel every 2 weeks. She could not call often because phone access was limited, so she wrote long, detailed letters telling him about her training, about the things she was learning, about the people she was meeting. She told him about the early mornings and the long runs and the complicated strategies she was studying. She told him about the friendships she was beginning to form with some of the other female cadets, women who, like her, had fought their way into a space that the world had tried to keep closed. She told him about Blessing, who had gone to nursing school and was writing to her from the coast. And she told him, in every single letter, that she was coming home for him, that everything she was doing was so that one day she could give him and their mother and their sister a life that their father had never been capable of providing. Samuel wrote back every time. His letters were short and full of spelling mistakes, and they were the most precious things Amara owned. He told her about school and about the dog he had adopted from the street. and about how he had started telling everyone that his sister was going to be the first female general in the country's history. He always ended his letters the same way. He wrote, "I am proud of you, sister." And every time Amara read those words, she folded the letter carefully, placed it in the small metal box she kept under her bunk, and felt the fire inside her burn a little brighter. The day Amara was commissioned as a second lieutenant was one of the proudest days of her life. Grace traveled to Kaduna for the ceremony. She wore a dress that Amara had sent money for, and she sat in the audience with tears running down her face as she watched her daughter march across the parade ground in full military uniform. The scars were visible, as they always were, but on that day, surrounded by the crisp lines of the military dress, they looked different. They did not look like marks of shame. They looked like battle scars. They looked like proof. Samuel could not come because he was in school, but Amara had called him the night before, and he had shouted so loud with excitement that Grace had to take the phone away because the neighbors were complaining. Joseph did not come. He was not invited. Amara had not spoken to her father since the day she left for boarding school, and she had no intention of ever speaking to him again. She had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for hers, because carrying hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. But forgiving him did not mean she owed him her presence or her success. He had tried to destroy her, and she had built herself into something he could never comprehend. That was enough. After commissioning, Amara was posted to a unit in the Northeast, one of the most dangerous and active zones in the country. It was a region torn apart by insurgency, where soldiers faced real combat, real danger, and real death on a regular basis. Many young officers requested transfers to safer postings. Amara did not. She had not joined the military to sit behind a desk. She had joined to serve, and service meant going where she was needed most. The Northeast tested Amara in ways that even the academy could not have prepared her for. She saw things that no human being should have to see. Burned villages, displaced families, children who had lost everything and everyone. She led patrols through terrain that was riddled with hidden explosives. She made decisions under fire that meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers under her command. And she did it all with a calm, steady competence that earned her the respect of soldiers who had initially been skeptical of taking orders from a woman, let alone a woman with scars that told a story she never shared. Her commanding officer in the Northeast was a major named Adesanya, a veteran who had been fighting in the region for 8 years and had seen more officers come and go than he could count. Major Adesanya was not easily impressed, but Amara impressed him. He watched her lead a platoon through an ambush, with a kind of composure that most officers did not develop until they had a decade of experience. He watched her sit with traumatized villagers and listen to their stories with a patience and empathy that went beyond professional duty. He watched her train her soldiers with the same relentless discipline that Colonel Barco had instilled in her years ago. And he wrote in his evaluation report that Lieutenant Amara was one of the most promising young officers he had ever served with, and that her potential for senior command was, in his words, extraordinary. The promotions came steadily after that, lieutenant to captain, captain to major. Each promotion brought new responsibilities, new challenges, and new rooms full of people who saw her scars before they saw her rank. But something was changing. The higher Amara climbed, the less the scars seemed to matter to the people around her. Not because the scars had faded, they had not, but because her reputation was beginning to precede her. People who met her for the first time had already heard about her. They had heard about the officer who had led the successful defense of a humanitarian corridor during one of the worst periods of the insurgency. They had heard about the woman who had redesigned the training protocol for female recruits and doubled the retention rate. They had heard about the major who slept in the field with her troops instead of in the officers' quarters because she believed that a leader who asked soldiers to endure discomfort should be willing to endure it herself. The scars were still there. They would always be there. But they were no longer the first thing people talked about when they mentioned Amara's name. Now, the first thing they talked about was her record, and her record spoke louder than any scar ever could. Years passed in the way that years do when a person is consumed by purpose. They do not crawl. They do not drag. They move like a river, steady and relentless, carrying everything forward whether the person is ready or not. Amara was always ready. She moved through the ranks of the military the way she had moved through every challenge in her life, with a quiet, burning intensity that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Major became lieutenant colonel. Lieutenant Colonel brought a transfer from the field to a strategic planning division at the defense headquarters in the capital city, Abuja. It was the kind of posting that many officers spent their entire careers hoping for. A seat at the table where decisions were made that affected the entire military apparatus of the country. Amara had not asked for it. She had been recommended by 3 separate senior officers who had each independently written to the Chief of Army Staff describing her as an officer of exceptional strategic ability and uncommon moral courage. Abuja was a different world from the Northeast. The Northeast was raw and dangerous and real. Abuja was polished and political and complicated. The corridors of defense headquarters were not battlefields, but they had their own kind of warfare. There were alliances and rivalries and power plays that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with personal ambition. Officers who had never seen combat wore their decorations like costumes and spoke about strategy as if it were a game played on paper, rather than a grim reality played out in blood and dust. Amara found the political maneuvering distasteful, but she navigated it with the same discipline she applied to everything else. She spoke only when she had something worth saying. She listened more than she talked. She studied the people around her, the way she had once studied textbooks, identifying strengths and weaknesses and motivations and blind spots. Not everyone at headquarters welcomed her presence. There were officers who had been in the system for decades, men who had risen through connections and family names and the quiet exchange of favors, and they looked at Amara with suspicion and resentment. A woman from a village nobody had heard of. A woman with scars that told a story of poverty and violence, and a background that had nothing in common with the privileged circles most senior officers came from. Some of them questioned her competence openly. Others did it behind closed doors, in meetings she was not invited to and conversations she was not supposed to hear. Among the skeptics was a brigadier general named Okonkwo, a man who had spent his career in administrative postings and had built his reputation not on battlefield excellence but on bureaucratic efficiency and political connections. Brigadier General Okonkwo was the kind of man who believed that the military had a natural order and that women, particularly women like Amara, disrupted that order. He never said this directly to Amara. He did not need to. His attitude was communicated through 1,000 small acts of dismissal. He would interrupt her during briefings. He would assign her to committees that were deliberately inconsequential. He would look past her when she entered a room, as if her rank were invisible. And once, during a closed-door meeting with other senior officers, he referred to her as that burned girl from the bush. He did not know that his aide-de-camp, a young captain who respected Amara deeply, overheard the comment and told her about it later that evening. Amara received the information with the same calm that she received everything. She did not confront Okonkwo. She did not file a complaint. She did not allow his words to penetrate the fortress she had built around her sense of self over decades of cruelty far worse than anything a bureaucratic general could deliver. She simply continued to do her work, and her work continued to speak. She authored a counterinsurgency strategy paper that was reviewed by the National Security Council and praised as one of the most comprehensive and practical documents produced by any military officer in recent years. She redesigned the logistics framework for troop deployment in the Northeast, eliminating redundancies that had been wasting millions in resources. She mentored young female officers who came to her, sometimes in tears, because they were facing the same kind of dismissal and harassment that she had faced for her entire career. During these years, Amara made sure to keep her promises. She had told her mother she would come back for her, and she did. With her officer's salary, she rented a small but clean apartment in Abuja and brought Grace to live with her. Grace was older now, her hair grey and her body tired from years of hard living. But when she walked into Amara's apartment and saw the clean floors and the running water and the bed with actual sheets, she sat down and wept. Not the desperate, frightened crying of the woman who had watched her daughter burn. This was the crying of a woman who had finally, after all those years, been given permission to rest. Amara held her mother and told her she would never have to go back to that house again. Grace asked about Joseph. Amara told her that Joseph was not her concern anymore. He had made his choices, and they had made theirs. Samuel had grown into a young man by this time. Amara had funded his education through secondary school, and then through university, where he studied engineering. He was tall like their father, but gentle like their mother. and he had inherited Amara's stubbornness and determination without the trauma that had forged hers. He called Amara every Sunday without fail, and their conversations were long and full of laughter and plans and the easy warmth of two people who had been through the worst together and come out the other side holding each other's hands. Samuel still told everyone he met that his sister was going to be a general. He said it with such conviction that people who did not know the family assumed it was already true. Esther had married a schoolteacher and lived in a town about 3 hours from the capital. She was quiet and content, and she called Amara once a month to check in. Daniel, the oldest brother, had stayed in their hometown. He ran a small shop at the market and drank too much, just like their father. Amara sent him money when he needed it, which was often, but they were not close. Daniel had never protected her or their mother. And though Amara did not hold it against him in the way she held things against Joseph, there was a distance between them that neither of them tried to close. Joseph died on a rainy evening in October. He was sitting in his chair, the same chair he had always sat in, when his heart simply stopped. He was 61 years old. Grace told Amara over the phone, and Amara listened, and then was quiet for a long time. She did not cry. She did not feel relief. She felt something that she could not quite name, something between emptiness and closure, like the last page of a book she had stopped reading a long time ago. She did not attend the funeral. She sent money for the burial expenses because she believed in doing the right thing, even for people who had never done the right thing for her. But she did not stand at his grave. She did not say goodbye. He had lost that right 20 years ago in a kitchen that smelled of boiling water and burning skin. The years that followed were defined by Amara's continued ascent. She was promoted to colonel and given command of a brigade, then brigadier general, making her one of the youngest women to ever hold that rank in the country's military history. Her reputation had grown beyond the military itself. She was invited to speak at international defense conferences. She sat on panels discussing women in combat roles and the integration of gender perspectives in military strategy. She advised foreign governments on counterinsurgency approaches. And through it all, she carried herself with the same quiet, unwavering dignity that had defined her since the day she walked back into her classroom with a burned face and refused to cry. But the moment that would define Amara's legacy, the moment that would become the story people told for years afterward, came on a warm afternoon in April at the National Defense College. The occasion was the annual Joint Services Leadership Seminar, a gathering of senior military officers, government officials, and international observers. It was one of the most prestigious events on the military calendar, a day when the most powerful people in the country's defense establishment gathered in one room to discuss strategy, policy, and the future of the armed forces. The auditorium was enormous. It seated over 500 people, and on this particular day, every seat was filled. The front rows were occupied by generals and admirals and air marshals, their uniforms heavy with decorations and insignia. Behind them sat colonels and brigadiers and senior civilian officials. The back rows were filled with younger officers, aides, and observers. The room hummed with the low murmur of conversation and the rustling of programs and the clinking of water glasses. Amara was in the room that day, seated in the middle section with other brigadier generals. She was scheduled to present a paper on integrated civil-military operations in conflict zones, a topic she had been working on for months and that drew on her extensive field experience in the Northeast. She was calm, as she always was before a briefing. She had her notes in a folder on her lap, and her uniform was impeccable, and her posture was straight, and her face, scarred and unscarred halves alike, showed nothing but composed readiness. But before Amara's presentation, there was an opening session, a round-table discussion among a panel of senior officers moderated by a civilian academic. The topic was leadership qualities in modern military command. The panelists were all men, all major generals or above, and they spoke with the comfortable authority of people who were used to being listened to. They discussed courage and decisiveness and strategic thinking and the importance of leading by example. It was the kind of discussion that could have been interesting but was mostly predictable, full of the expected answers and the expected nods of agreement from the audience. Then one of the panelists, a major general whom Amara did not know personally, made a comment that shifted the energy in the room. He was speaking about the importance of presentation and bearing in military leadership, about how a commanding officer's appearance set the tone for their entire unit. He spoke about the need for officers to project strength and confidence through their physical presence, and then, almost as an aside, he glanced toward the section where Amara was sitting and said that some people were simply not built for command. that there were certain physical and personal limitations that no amount of training or education could overcome, that the military needed leaders who could inspire confidence at first sight, and that, unfortunately, not everyone had been dealt that hand. He did not say Amara's name. He did not need to. The glance was enough. Several heads in the audience turned toward Amara. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked away, embarrassed by the implication, but unwilling to challenge a major general in public. The moderator cleared his throat and tried to move the discussion forward, but the damage was done. The comment hung in the air like smoke, and everyone in that room knew exactly who it was directed at. Amara sat perfectly still. Her face showed nothing. Her hands did not move. She looked straight ahead at the panel with the same steady, unflinching gaze that she had turned on her father when she was 7 years old. The gaze that said, "I see you and I am not afraid, and you cannot break what has already been broken and rebuilt stronger." There was a short break before the next session. People stood and stretched and moved toward the refreshment tables in the bathrooms. Some of them glanced at Amara as they passed. A few of the younger officers, people who knew her reputation and admired her, looked at her with expressions of sympathy and outrage, but nobody said anything. In the military, you do not challenge a major general, especially not in a room full of people who outrank you. The break ended, and people returned to their seats. The next item on the program was announced. It was Amara's presentation. She stood, picked up her folder, and walked to the podium at the front of the auditorium. 500 pairs of eyes followed her. Some of those eyes were curious, some were sympathetic, some were hostile, and some, the ones belonging to people who knew her record, were expectant. Amara placed her folder on the podium, opened it, and looked out at the audience. She did not begin with her paper. She did not begin with the data, or the strategy, or the policy recommendations. She began with silence. She stood there and let the room settle, and she looked at them, all of them, generals and colonels and officials and observers, and she let the silence do its work. The room grew still. The murmuring stopped. The rustling stopped. 500 people sat in complete silence and waited for the woman with the scarred face to speak. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the auditorium without effort. She said that before she began her presentation, she wanted to address something that had been said earlier. She said that she had heard throughout her entire life that she was not built for the things she wanted to do. She had been told she was not built for school. She had been told she was not built for the military. She had been told she was not built for command. She had been told by people who had never survived a single day of what she had survived that her scars made her less than them. She paused and let the words settle. The room was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. Then she said that she wanted to tell them what she was built for. She was built for a childhood where the person who was supposed to protect her tried to destroy her. She was built for a town that looked the other way. She was built for a school where children called her a monster. She was built for an academy where men told her she did not belong. She was built for a war zone where she led soldiers through ambushes and brought them home alive. She was built for every room she had ever walked into, where the first thing people saw was not her rank or her record, but the scars on her face. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes did not water. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. She said that scars are not weaknesses. They are receipts. They are proof of survival. And any leader who believes that strength is measured by the smoothness of someone's skin has never been tested by anything that matters. The auditorium was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked at their phones or their programs. 500 people sat frozen, held in place by the force of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and who was, in that moment, making every single person in that room feel the full weight of how wrong they had been. Then something happened that nobody expected. A door at the side of the auditorium opened. Heads turned. Through the door walked a man in full military dress uniform with 4 stars on his shoulders. It was the Chief of Army Staff, the highest-ranking officer in the entire Nigerian army, General Ibrahim Musa. He was not scheduled to attend this session. He had been in a separate meeting in another building on the Defense College campus, but someone on his staff had sent him a message about what was happening in the auditorium, and he had come. General Musa walked down the center aisle of the auditorium with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who commanded the attention of every room he entered. Simply by existing in it, he walked all the way to the front of the room. He did not go to the panel table. He did not go to the VIP section. He walked directly to the podium where Amara was standing. The room held its breath. General Musa stopped in front of Amara. He was a tall man with a broad chest and a face that showed the wear of decades of service. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to face the audience, and in a voice that carried the weight of every star on his uniform, he said that he wanted to make an announcement. He said that effective immediately by recommendation of the Army Council and with the approval of the President, Brigadier General Amara was being promoted to the rank of Major General. The room erupted. Not in the polite applause that usually followed such announcements at military events. This was something else. This was a sound that started as a gasp and became a murmur and then became applause that built and built until it was thunderous. Officers who had sat silently during the panel discussion were now on their feet. Young female officers in the back rows were standing with tears running down their faces, clapping so hard their hands hurt. Even some of the older generals, men who had been part of the system that had tried to keep women like Amara in the margins, stood and applauded, because whatever their personal feelings about gender or appearance or tradition, they could not deny what they had just witnessed. They could not deny that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. General Musa turned back to Amara. He reached into the pocket of his uniform and removed a set of rank insignia, 2 silver stars. The insignia of a major general. He pinned them to Amara's shoulders himself, right there at the podium, in front of 500 witnesses. Then, he stepped back, came to attention, and saluted her. The Chief of Army Staff saluted her. Amara returned the salute. Her hand was steady. Her back was straight. Her face, both sides of it, the smooth and the scarred, were set in an expression that was not joy and not triumph and not relief. It was peace. A deep, profound peace that comes only to people who have walked through fire and come out the other side carrying not bitterness but purpose. General Musa then turned to the audience one final time and said something that would be quoted in newspapers and military journals and spoken about in training academies for years to come. He said that Major General Amara carried on her face the evidence of a battle she fought when she was 12 years old. He said that she had won that battle. And she had won every battle since. He said that if anyone in that room believed that a soldier's worth was determined by the perfection of their appearance rather than the content of their service, then they had failed to understand the most basic principle of military leadership. And he said that Major General Amara's call sign, the name she was known by on military communications, was chosen by her and approved by him personally. Her call sign was Phoenix. And there was not a person in that room who did not understand why. The Major General who had made the comment during the panel sat in his chair and did not move. His face was pale. He did not clap. He did not stand. He stared straight ahead at the podium where the woman he had dismissed was now wearing 2 stars that put her at his exact rank. He would never make a public comment about her again. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and the congratulations and the photographs, Amara stepped outside the auditorium, into the warm April air. She pulled out her phone and called Samuel. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did when she called. She told him what had happened. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Samuel's voice came through, thick with emotion, and he said just one thing. He said, "I always knew." That evening, Amara sat in her apartment with Grace. Her mother was sitting on the sofa holding the 2 silver stars in her hands, turning them over and over like they were made of something more precious than metal. Grace looked up at her daughter and said that she wished she had been braver. That she wished she had taken Amara and left Joseph all those years ago. That she was sorry for every scar, every bruise, every night of fear. Amara knelt in front of her mother and took her hands. She told Grace that she did not need an apology. She told her that Grace had done the best she could with what she had. She told her that every night Grace had stayed up tending Amara's burns. Every letter she had written to her at the academy, every prayer she had whispered over her daughter's name, had been enough. More than enough. She told her mother that the scars were not Grace's fault. They were Joseph's. And Joseph was gone. But they were here. They were alive. They were together. And that was the only thing that mattered. Grace pulled Amara into her arms and held her the way she had held her on that terrible night in the back of Mr. Adebayo's car, racing toward a hospital that felt like it was at the end of the world. But this time there was no pain. This time there was no fear. This time the only thing between them was love and survival, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they had made it. Amara went on to serve with distinction for many more years. She became one of the most decorated female officers in the history of the country's military. She established a foundation for survivors of domestic violence, funding shelters, legal aid, and educational scholarships for women and children escaping abusive homes. She returned to her old school and funded the construction of a new library, which she named after Mrs. Okoro, the teacher who had first told her that her mind was her greatest weapon. She visited the Nigerian Defense Academy every year to address the incoming class of cadets, and she always began her speech the same way. She would stand at the podium in her full Major General's uniform, her scars visible and unhidden, and she would say 4 words that became legendary in military circles. She would say, "Scars are not endings." And every single cadet in that room, every young man and woman who had fought their way into that academy carrying their own wounds and their own doubts and their own stories of being told they were not enough, would sit up a little straighter and believe her, because the proof was standing right in front of them. A woman who had been burned and mocked and dismissed and underestimated. A woman who had been called half-face and monster and damaged goods and that burned girl from the bush. A woman who had walked into rooms where people saw her scars before they saw her rank, and had stayed in those rooms long enough for them to see her rank, her record, her courage, and her heart. A woman whose call sign was Phoenix. A woman who had risen from the ashes and set the entire sky on fire. Samuel kept his promise too. He became an engineer and built bridges across rivers in parts of the country that had been cut off from the rest of the world for decades. Whenever anyone asked him why he chose to build bridges, he said it was because his sister had taught him that the most important thing a person can do is create a path for someone else to cross. He carried a photograph of Amara in his wallet. It was not the photograph from the market when he was 3. It was a new one, taken on the day of her promotion, showing her in full uniform, with 2 stars on her shoulders and the sun catching the left side of her face in a way that made the scars look like rivers of gold. He showed that photograph to everyone he met, and he always said the same thing. "That is my sister." They mocked her scars, and then the general silenced the room.